Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. And it's a very exciting morning because we're going to do the last chapter of The Great Gatsby. Now, I think the last time I read was on Friday morning, and this was a very long chapter, chapter 7, and I didn't have time to finish it. We had to stop in the middle. So today we're reading the last half of chapter 7, and then we're going to read the final chapter, chapter 8. If this is your first time watching, we're not just reading through the words. We're stopping and we're talking about vocabulary words that if you're learning English, you probably don't know, or phrases which you probably don't understand if you're learning English. And we're doing this live, so if you're watching with me live, then I encourage you to leave comments and make questions in the chat so that... technical difficulties. 1 second. Oh no. So I encourage you to ask questions in the chat. I encourage you to make comments in the chat. That's what makes it more interesting, because you could find the audiobook probably already on YouTube. But this is a way to ask questions about things you don't understand. That's the whole point of this video. If you don't ask questions, then I'll just stop sometimes and explain words I think you probably don't know, or phrases you probably don't understand, or things that you might find useful. But definitely I encourage you to participate. Okay, well, so we left off, we stopped in the middle of chapter 7 last time, and so today's going to be a little bit extra long. We're going to read the rest of chapter 7, and then we'll read chapter 8, which is the final chapter. Now, the place where we left off in chapter 7, everybody went to New York, and they were drinking and having a good time, and then they all got into a fight, and all the secrets came out that Gatsby and Daisy were having an affair. They decided to go back home. They were driving back home, Gatsby and Daisy in one car, and the rest of the gang, I guess, in the other car. Miriam says chapter 9 is the final chapter. Oh, I guess we've got 2 chapters then. I'm going to read the rest of the book today. It's about 40 pages. I just assumed that the final chapter was chapter 8 because, I don't know, there's only about 20 pages left when you get to chapter 8. So everybody gets into a fight, they're drinking, all the secrets come out, and then they're driving back to West Egg or East Egg, and there's a horrible car accident. And that's where we left off. That's where we stopped. So let's continue with in the middle of chapter 7. Tom is driving back home, and he's going past the gas station where the woman where he's having an affair lives with her husband. And there's a car accident in the middle of the road. So he's driving, he sees the car accident, and he says, seems some bad trouble here, said Tom excitedly. He reached up on his tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads in the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light in a swinging wire basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat. Harsh, we've talked about that word before, but I'm just going to remind you that harsh means something that's very intense and also unpleasant, not very nice. So, harsh weather means very intense weather, but you don't like it. It's not nice. If the wind is harsh, it's too intense. It's unpleasant. A harsh light is an intense light, and it's not nice. You don't like it. Okay, let's see. Where did harsh go? Then he made a harsh sound. So he made a harsh sound. It was very loud and unpleasant. It wasn't something that people like to hear. and with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals disarranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly in. Oh, N is asking about thrust. Thrust is a big, strong push. That's what thrust is. Well, where's the camera? Push, like this. Thrust. How did they use it here? They said... Where did it go? Then he made a harsh sound with his throat, and with a violent thrusting movement like this, he's pushing people aside, pushing forward of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. So he's pushing people out of his way to see what is in the middle of this circle of people. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all, and the new arrivals disarranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly inside. You see, if you're going to use that word, if you're going to use this idea of pushing all the time, you have to use different words. It would be a little bit annoying if you always said push. But I think also thrust, you think of that as being much stronger, much forceful than push. Myrtle Wilson's body, wrapped in a blanket, and then in another blanket, as though she suffered from chill in the hot night, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle police taking down names. That's a very common phrasal verb. To take something down means to write something quickly. So if the policeman is taking down names, he's writing very quickly the names of the witnesses on a document or in a notebook. People say take down all the time instead of write. Here, take down my phone number. Take down this address. And that just means write it quickly. Here, it's not so fast. It's not going to take a long time. Just write it very quickly. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman, taking down names with much sweat and correction in a little book. At first, I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bare garage. And then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth. This is swaying, moving like this. But because he says swaying back and forth, maybe like this. Maybe it's like this that he's doing that. Miriam is asking about clamor. I don't know if you know the word clumsy. Like not very coordinated, not very accurate is clumsy. Wait, let me see. Clamorous. Oh, actually, I'm thinking of clamor as a verb. Wait, to clamor. Oh, that's funny. It's not what I thought. That's why I check. But clamor is making a loud noise. But I kind of think of it as something where there's no direction to it. Okay. But clamoring is making a loud noise, a loud, confused noise, especially that of people shouting vehemently, meaning like with a lot of energy or anger or something like that. So let's see. Groaning words that echoed clamorously, so loud and confused, through the garage, the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying. This is swaying back and forth. If you see the wind, if you see grass or flowers and there's some wind and the grass or the flowers move like this, you say the flowers are swaying in the wind, swaying in the breeze. Or you could be swaying to music. This is swaying to music. But Wilson is swaying back and forth. He's swaying like this because he's in a very confused and stressed state. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding the doorposts with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting from time to time to lay a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the laden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again that he gave out incessantly in high, horrible call. Wait, let me read that again. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again. Jerk is like a sudden movement. So his eyes would drop slowly. So he was looking at the light, and then he would look down to the table, and then jerk back. Jerk is a very quick movement. Jerk back to the light again, and gave out the incessantly high, horrible call. N is asking about threshold. Threshold is the area of a door. That little space between one room and another room is the threshold. It's like the imaginary line on the floor of a door. That's the threshold. So you could say, for example, I'm on the threshold of getting angry. And that means, well, I'm on this side of the door of getting angry, but I'm about to step through to the other room where anger is. So you can use that word threshold to mean I'm going from one state to another state. But I think here they actually are talking literally about he's standing in a doorway and he's holding on to the side of the door. He's literally in the threshold of the door. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Presently, Tom lifted his head with a jerk, and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a mumbled, incoherent remark to the policeman. Mav, the policeman was saying. Oh, no, R, corrected the man. Mavro? Listen to me, muttered Tom fiercely. R, said the policeman. Oh, G, I don't know what they're doing. G. He looked up as Tom's broad hand fell sharply on his shoulder. What you want, fella? What happened? That's what I want to know. Auto hit her. Instantly killed. Instantly killed, repeated, staring. She ran out in the road. Son of a bitch. Didn't even stop us. Didn't even stop us car. Oh, that's weird. I'm not sure what that means. Didn't even stop us car. Oh, stop his. Maybe it's stop his. Didn't even stop his car. But I think it was a woman driving. There was 2 cars, said Michaelis. One coming and one going. See? Going where? Asked the policeman keenly. Keenly here means like very interested in what he has to say. One going each way. Well, she... His hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. She ran out there, and the one coming from New York knocked right into her, going 30 or 40 miles an hour. What's the name of this place here? Demanded the officer. Hasn't got any name. A pale, well-dressed Negro stepped near. It was a yellow car, he said. Big yellow car, new. See the incident? Asked the policeman. No, but the car passed me down the road, going faster than 45. going 50, 60. For those of you who don't know miles, this is like 100 kilometers. 50 is like 100 kilometers an hour, and 60 is like 120 kilometers an hour. Come here. Let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door. Miriam says, pass me down the road. I don't even remember seeing that, pass me down the road. Oh, no, but the car passed me down the road. Okay, you know, this is funny because I think this is something that confuses a lot of people learning English. They hate this. I think all people learning English hate this, but when people are talking about streets or directions, we like to use the word up and down. So if you come to me and you say, where's the gas station? Where's the bank? I might say, oh, it's up the road, or it's down the road. And it means the same thing. It's up the road. That just means just keep following the road and eventually you'll find the bank. Or it's down the road. And that still means the same thing. It doesn't have anything to do with up or down. It's just a way of talking about directions. So I can say, it's just down the road, the bank. And it still means you just follow the road, go in the direction you're going. And that's a very common thing to say, up the road, down the road. So when he says the car passed me, that's enough. Okay, the car passed me. What did he say again? Where did it go? But it didn't happen right there at the gas station. It either happened in this direction or that direction on the road. And now somehow he's arrived at the gas station. So when he says the car passed me down the road, it just means it was maybe a little ways north or south or east or west from the gas station. Come here and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. Gasping is what you do to get air quickly. That's gasping. That's gasping for air. So he's having gasping cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. A wad is like a collection of something that can come together. If you take some clothes and you do like this. Wait, let's look at the word wad for a minute. Let's see what kind of things we get. Okay. So a wad is like a collection of things grouped together. So this is a wad of money. And it's funny how that's really the only thing that they show is money. But I could think of it like... the thing I thought of was clothes. Don't get your panties in a wad. Oh boy. That's all they show is money. Well, that's a little bit disappointing. When you put a lot of things together, you collect them into a small space, condense them. When you condense a lot of things into one small space, you can call that a wad of something. Especially if it's long and flexible. But they only show money here. Okay. Well... hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. Come here. Let's have your name. Look out now. Some of the words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle. So his muscles are contracting. He's very tense. The wad of muscles in his back. And his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and, standing up in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms. "You've got to pull yourself together," he said, with soothing gruffness. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He started up, his tiptoes, and then would have collapsed to his knees had not Tom held him upright. "Listen," said Tom, shaking him a little. "I got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine. Do you hear? I haven't seen it at all afternoon." So it sounds to me like Tom is trying to tell Wilson, "Don't tell the police I know about this car. I've never seen this car before," which is interesting. Only the Negro and I were enough to hear what he said. We're near enough to hear what he said, but the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. What does that mean, truculent? See, I can see that I've looked these words up before because they're in purple when I do the search, but I don't remember. I guess I have a horrible memory. Eager or quick to argue or fight. Truculent. That's very fancy English. Probably if you use that, most people won't know what you're talking about. But if you use it, people, I guess, would be very impressed. He was very truculent with me. "What's all that?" he demanded. "I'm a friend of his." Tom turned his head, but kept his hands firmly on Wilson's body. "He says he knows the car that did it. It was the yellow car." Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. Oh, Anne is saying walk over is approaching. Let's see, how did they use it? Well, we have look over to hear what the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. "What's all that?" he demanded. "I'm a friend of his." Tom turned his head but kept his hands firmly on Wilson's body. "He says he knows the car that did it. It was the yellow car." Where was walkover? He walked quickly over. Yeah, he approached. But I think, the difference between approach and walk over is when you say that he approached, that just means like come near. So when you say he approached the man, that means he came over. He came near. He came near the man. But if you say he walked over to, you've got to use the preposition to. He walked over to the man. That means he went where he was exactly, not near, but where he was. So there's a little bit of a difference there. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. And what color is your car?" "It's a blue coupe." "We've come straight from New York," I said. And someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away. "Now, if you'll let me have the name again, correct?" Picking up Wilson like a doll, Tom carried him into the office, set him down in a chair, and came back. If somebody'll come here and sit with him," he snapped authoritatively. He watched while two men standing closest glanced at each other and went unwillingly into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's go out." Self-consciously, with his authoritative arms breaking the way. We pushed through the still gathering crowd, and passing a hurried doctor, case in hand, who had been sent for in wild hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly. N is asking, shut the door on them. Well, if you just shut the door, that's just closing the door. Shut means close. You shut windows, you shut doors. That just means close the window, close the door. When you shut the door on someone, that means they're standing in the door looking at you, and you shut the door. So when someone shuts the door on you, that's not very nice. That's just like hanging up the phone. So you hang up the phone. But if you hang up the phone on someone, that's like, hello, I would like to sell you a new credit card. And you just hang up the phone. I hung up the phone on that guy. It's kind of rude to shut the door on someone or to hang up the phone on someone. Oh, N says, yes, that, I know that. Just on them? What happened was Wilson, who is the husband of Martha. Martha was a woman having an affair with Tom. He's very upset. And Tom is afraid that Wilson is going to somehow implicate him in this death of his wife. And so he even said to him, look, I've never seen that car before, okay? When you're talking to the police, I've never seen that car before. He didn't do anything that I know of, but he's afraid that he's going to be somehow involved in this. So he's telling Wilson, who's very upset because his wife just died, look, I have nothing to do with this. Come on, get yourself together. And he's trying to get him away from the police. So he says, go in that office, go in there. And so Tom goes in the office, or Wilson goes in the office, who's very upset. And he says to some strangers, somebody go in there with him, keep him company. He's very upset. So two strange guys said, well, okay. And so they walked into the office to keep company with Wilson, whose wife just died. And once they entered, Tom shut the door on them. So maybe they said, what do we do next? Shut the door. Okay, let's see. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend. Then his foot came down hard, and the coupe raced along through the night. In a little while, I heard a low, husky sob. Husky means strong, deep, fat. A low, husky sob, and saw that the tears were overflowing down his face. The goddamn coward, he whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark, rustling trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor where the two windows bloomed with light among the vines. Daisy's home, he said. Oh, I thought Daisy was dead. Okay. Daisy's home, he said. As we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. I ought to have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight. A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely and with decision. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home. And while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper if you want any. He opened the door. Come in. No thanks, but I'd be glad if you'd order me a taxi. I'll wait outside. Jordan put her hand on my arm. Won't you come in, Nick? No thanks. I was feeling a little sick, and I wanted to be alone, but Jordan lingered there for a moment. We've seen that word linger before. That means to stay when you're supposed to leave, when it's a good idea to leave. To linger is to stay in one place, but you really shouldn't be there. You should probably be leaving. You don't go away. You won't go away. It's only 9:30, she said. I'd be damned if I'd go in. I've had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands, until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler's voice calling a taxi. And then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between two bushes into a path. I must have felt pretty weird by that time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. "What are you doing?" I inquired. "Just standing here, old sport." Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. So just imagine this super rich Gatsby is hiding in the bushes on the property of the Buchanans. He's, "Nick, come over here." He's like, "What are you doing? This is weird." For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see the sinister faces, the faces of Wolsheim's people, behind him in the dark shrubbery. Despicable. Anne is asking about the word despicable. To me, despicable means like easy to hate. But let's see. Let's check the real definition. Despicable. Deserving of hatred or contempt. So this is a very despicable thing to do, to be hiding in the bushes on someone's property. That's something that you can easily hate. It's very understandable that you would hate something like that. It's a despicable thing. Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. So occupation here means something to do. So that's something to do that I really hate. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see the sinister faces, the faces of Wolsheim's people, behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yeah." "I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that she should all come... it's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it pretty well." Anne is asking about shrubbery. Well, a shrub is a bush. If you know what a bush is, but maybe you don't know what a bush is. I'll just get a picture here. It's like a small bush. Well, not always. I don't think it's always small. But this is a bush. See, it's funny because you've got President Bush, and this is a bush, and a shrub is kind of like a smaller bush, and people who hated George Bush used to call him the shrub. So that's what you get. You get pictures of presidents and bushes when you Google that word. So shrubbery, that just means like a collection of bushes. So you can imagine sometimes bushes make a fence. You could have a bush like lining the side of your property like a fence, like a barrier, and you could call that shrubbery. So Gatsby's in there and he says, "Psst, Nick, come over here." "You see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes." "I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so." It's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it pretty well. He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. I got to West Egg by a side road, he went on, and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us, but of course I can't be sure. I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. Who was the woman? He inquired. Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage. How the devil did it happen? Well, how the devil did it happen? Well, I tried to swing the wheel. He broke off, and suddenly I guessed at the truth. Was Daisy driving? Yes, he said after a moment, but of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her to drive. Miriam says, Tom's mistress is the person who was hit by the car. That's Martha, the wife of the gas station owner. So yes, she's the person who was hit by the car, and Daisy is the one who killed her. Yes, he said after a moment, but of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her drive, and this woman rushed out at us just as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute. But it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, thought we were somebody she knew. Well, first Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, and then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel, I felt the shock. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open. Don't tell me, old sport, he winced. This is wincing. Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. Okay, when you say step on it, that means go as fast as you can. Because what they're saying is step on the gas, put your foot on the gas. So when you say step on it, that means go as fast as the car can take you. So anyway, Daisy stepped on it. So she hits and kills someone, and the first thing she does is put her foot on the gas all the way. Don't tell me, old sport, he winced. Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled on the emergency brake, and then she fell over into my lap, and I drove on. A lot of times when you have a phrasal verb, not always, but sometimes when you have a phrasal verb that ends with on, it has the idea of continue. So when you're talking to someone and they say, go on, that means continue talking, tell me the rest of the story. That's a very common phrasal verb that means continue talking. You've seen that famous sign, keep calm and carry on. Carry on also, like, that means continue with your life. And here, how did they use it? Drive on. That means she continued driving. Of course, on doesn't always mean that with a phrasal verb, but sometimes it could mean that. She'll be all right tomorrow, he said presently. I'm just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about that unpleasantness this afternoon. She's locked herself into her room, and if he tries any brutality, she's going to turn the light on, out and on again. So if Tom gets violent with her, she's going to turn the light on and off in her bedroom, and Gatsby will know that she's in trouble. And I guess he'll go and save her and rescue her. He won't touch her, I said. He's not thinking about her. I don't trust him, old sport. How long are you going to wait? All night if I have to. All night if necessary. Anyhow, till they all go to bed. A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it. He might think anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs, and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the second floor. "You wait here," I said. "I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion." A commotion is like a chaos or a fight or some kind of problem that causes a lot of noise. I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open, and I saw that the room was empty. Crossing the porch, where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light, which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table, with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon the covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. This was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. So they weren't fighting. It seems like they were just trying to work things out at the kitchen table. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I had left him in the drive. "It's all quiet up there." "It's all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yeah, it's all quiet." I hesitated. "You'd better come home and get some sleep." He shook his head. He shook his head. "I want to wait here until Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport." He put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. To mar something, that means like to pollute something or to make it dirty. But let me just check, because I don't really trust my own definition. To mar something. To ruin or diminish the perfection or wholeness of something, to spoil something. I would say like pollute, to make it dirty, to make it less nice. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 7, and now we're moving on to chapter 8. We're going to finish this book today. I don't care how long it takes. It shouldn't take long, because I think there are only about 30 pages left. Okay, chapter 8. I couldn't sleep all night. A foghorn was groaning in the incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. When you're sleeping, if you're trying to sleep and you're worried about something, maybe you do this. You go from side to side because you're feeling anxious or nervous. And this is called tossing and turning. Tossing means to throw something, tossing. But tossing and turning is when you're in bed doing this. So he's saying, in this line he says, I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. So he's thinking about the reality. Oh, the reality's horrible. Oh no, I'm having a horrible dream. Oh, the reality's horrible. He's tossing between these two things in his bed. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against the table in the hall, heavy with dejection and sleep. Nothing happened, he said wanly. We've seen this word wan, which I had no idea what that word was. It's not a word that people use these days. Wan means like tired. So now I finally remember this word after seeing it several times. Wan. So nothing happened, he said wanly, meaning he was very tired, exhausted. I waited, and about 4 o'clock, she came to the window and stood there for a minute and then turned out the light. His house had never seemed so enormous to me as it did that night when we hunted through the great rooms for cigarettes. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric light switches. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. Sirkan Sonal says, we're united with you in this endeavor. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I hope you stay till the end. We're going to finish this book today. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere. This word explicable, that's a Latin word, explicar. That means explain. It's the same word. It's the same word in English, explain, explicable. And so inexplicable means I can't explain it. You can't give me a reason for it. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere. So you look at the dust and you think, how can there be so much dust? That's what inexplicable means. And the rooms were musty, as though they hadn't been aired for many days. Musty is the smell of mold. Do you know what mold is? Let's see. Let's see what kind of horrible pictures we get with mold. This is mold. M-O-L-D. And if you've ever smelled that smell is a musty smell. So you could have moldy bread that has a special smell to it. And then you say, oh, that bread smells musty. So the rooms smelled musty because it seems like to Nick, it seems like they haven't opened the windows and let in fresh air for a very long time. So the rooms smelled musty. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty, as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor on an unfamiliar table. A humidor is a box where you put cigars, where you keep cigars so that they stay fresh. With 2 stale, dry cigarettes inside. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing room, we sat smoking out into the darkness. You ought to go away, I said. It's pretty certain they'll trace your car. Go away? Now, old sport? Go to Atlantic City for a week, or up to Montreal. He wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because J. Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. I think that he would have acknowledged anything now without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. To discern something is to make something clear. If you discern something, something becomes clear. If something is indiscernible, it means it's not clear. You don't really see it. You can't really see it because it isn't clear. So he's saying there was always, Gatsby had met nice girls before, but there was always some kind of barrier between him and these girls. That's why he says indiscernible. Barbed wire is, let's see, barbed wire. This is barbed wire. So that's like a barrier that is very difficult to pass, barbed wire. So there was always some indiscernible barbed wire between him and the girls that he met, some kind of barrier that kept them from connecting. Anne is asking about play out. Let's see, where was that? I don't remember seeing that. Oh, here it is. Okay, Tom's, let's see. Let's start from the beginning of the paragraph. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because J. Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. To play something out means to reveal everything. Let's say that. It's kind of a hard word to explain, but when something plays out, you see how it goes until the end. You see it from the beginning to the end, like a play. You know, you go to the theater and you watch a play. It's kind of like a movie, but it's with people who are alive in front of you. When something plays out, you watch it. I don't know if you know the word fold, but there's a verb to unfold. So when you watch something unfold, it's like you watch the incident go from the beginning to the end. It starts like this, and then you unfold it, and then you see the complete picture at the end. And that's what play out means also. I hope that made sense. If that didn't make sense, let me know. I'll try to think of another way to explain it. I don't know if that made sense to you. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come into contact with such people, but always with an indiscernible barbed wire between. So he had been in contact with very nice people before, but there was always a barrier between them. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house. At first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before, but what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing as to her his tent out at camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent. And this year's shining motor cars, and of dancing and dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. He felt their presence all about the house. Pervading means it's everywhere. Pervading the air. It was everywhere in the air, this feeling. Pervading the air with shades and echoes, still vibrant emotions. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. Colossal means extremely big. However glorious might be his future as J. Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past. And at any moment, the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So he was attractive because he was a soldier wearing a soldier's uniform. But if he wasn't wearing that, he wouldn't be very interesting to anyone. He wasn't rich, he wasn't educated, he wasn't anything. So if he hadn't been wearing that uniform, he'd be nobody. So he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night. Took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. He might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that she was a person that he was a person from much the same stratum as herself, and that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable to... I think what they mean by he took her was he slept with her. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable, at the whim of an impersonal government, to be blown anywhere in the world. But he didn't despise himself, and he didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he could and go. So, for some reason, he's there at this rich lady's house, in his uniform, looking very nice in his soldier's uniform. And he knows that this cannot be a permanent thing because he's poor. He's not from any special family. He's just some guy in a uniform. But he lies and tells Daisy that he's from a very special family. He's very rich, to make her fall in love with him. But he's not thinking that it's going to go past this experience. So he's okay with it. And he knows that at any minute the government is going to send him to some country far away to fight a war. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her. That was all. When they met again, 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier. Huskier is like deep and strong. She had a cold, so she was talking like this. And more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't. Because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute. And all of a sudden, I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? On the last afternoon before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day, with fire in the room, and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark, shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly one with another than when she brushed silent lips brushing against his coat shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers gently as though she were asleep. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain. Before he went to the front and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her, and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery, and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled in the shining dust. At the gray tea hour, there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals, blown by the sad horns around the floor. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly, she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men and drowsing asleep at dawn. Anne is asking about the word redolent. I was kind of worried. I was thinking about that word myself. Let's look it up. Redolent. Let's see. Smelling strongly of something or having qualities, especially smells, that make you think of... Wait, let me see the rest of this. That make you think of something else. So a redolent, something that is redolent has a strong smell and it reminds you of something else. Let's go back and take a look at how they use that word. Where was it? For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year. So Daisy was young, and she was surrounded by particular flowers like orchids. So those orchids, if you smell them now, it reminds you of that time. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men and drowsing asleep at dawn, with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among the dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately. and the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality that was close at hand. That force took the shape in the middle of the spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. It was dawn now on Long Island, and we went about opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house with gray turning, gold turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and the ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves, and there was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from the window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was some kind of cheap sharper, and the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. Of course, she might have loved him just for a minute when they were first married, and loved me more even then. Do you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that except to suspect some intensity in the conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip, and made miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville. On the last of his army pay, he stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night, and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than the other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her. He was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by, then out into the spring fields, where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along a casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanquishing city, where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of hair, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon, and there's always been trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today, Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. You know, old sport, I've never used that pool all summer. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work. But I was more than that. But it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train, and then another, before I could get myself away. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Daisy'll call too. He looked at me anxiously, as if he hoped I'd corroborated this. So he says, I suppose Daisy will call too. And then he looks at, corroborate means like agree. Like, yeah, that's probably going to happen. So he says, I hope Daisy will call me too. And then he looks at Nick like, what do you think? You think that she'll call me? Like waiting for me to say, yeah, probably she'll call you. And so Nick answers, I suppose so. Well, goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. Well, that's weird. So he's saying that all those other people are horrible, but you're good. He doesn't seem so good to me. I don't know. I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from the beginning to the end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots. In fact, all together. To be in cahoots with someone means to be planning some kind of secret together. So they are in cahoots to rob a bank, means they're secretly planning to rob a bank together. If you have a good friend and you're always causing trouble, you can say, we are in cahoots together. That means we're always planning and causing trouble together. It could be funny. It could be serious and bad. It doesn't matter. How did he use it here, to be in cahoots? That's a funny word. I missed it. I disapproved of him from the beginning to the end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into a radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. So he's saying, like, as if we both always agreed that we hated all of these people, but we always liked each other, is kind of what it means. Like we shared this little secret this whole time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and the drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood at those steps concealing his incorruptible dream as he waved them goodbye. I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thankful. We were always thanking him for that. I and the others. Goodbye, I called. I enjoyed the breakfast, Gatsby. Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock, and then I fell asleep in my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up. With sweat breaking out of my forehead, it was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between the hotels and the clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window. What's a divot? Anne is asking about interminable. Well, Anne, you probably know the word terminate, right? What does terminate mean? Terminate means finish. And able means can. So terminable means can finish. But interminable means never finishing. So if you say interminable, that's a pretty fancy word for something that continues forever. Let's see, divot, meaning. Oh, they're talking about gulf divot. Oh, wait. A divot is a small hole in an area of grass, especially one made by a golf club. Oh, okay. So a divot is this. Not that this is an important word, but it's just if you make some kind of motion on the ground and it causes a disruption in the ground, I guess that's a divot. All right. Where did we see the word interminable? So interminable means never ending. Let's see how it was used. Where did it go? Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. So he's got this never-ending list of stocks and stock prices and stock histories, and it never ends. It just goes on forever and ever and ever. That's all it means. Swivel, N is asking about the word swivel chair. Swivel is this movement. I don't know if you can see. Swivel is this movement. So a swivel chair is a chair that can turn in all directions. That's a swivel chair. I left Daisy's house, she said. I'm at Hampstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon. Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. You weren't so nice to me last night. How could it have mattered then? Silence for a moment, then. However, I want to see you. I want to see you too. Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon. No, I don't think this afternoon. Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. And I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. N is asking about the word rigid. Rigid means doesn't move, can't move. If something is rigid, it doesn't go this way or that way. It stays maybe you know the word stiff. Stiff and rigid are very similar words. Very difficult to move it or bend it. How do they use the word rigid? Probably it had been tactful to Daisy to leave Daisy's house. But the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. So imagine, you're talking to someone on the phone, you're very relaxed, and then they say something that makes you angry or irritates you, and suddenly you feel very tense. And when you're tense, you can't really move, or you don't really move, so you're rigid. Your muscles are rigid. They won't move. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:50 train, and then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. When I passed the ash heaps on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I suppose there'd be a curious crowd around there all day, with little boys searching for dark spots in the dust, and some garrulous man telling over and over what happened until it became less and less real even to him, and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now I want to go back. a little and tell what happened at the garage after we left there the night before. They had difficulty in locating the sister, Catherine. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she had arrived she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. Who's Catherine? I don't remember anybody named Catherine. Somebody's sister. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted, as if that was the intolerable part of the affair. Someone kind or curious took her in his car and drove her in the wake of her sister's body. So Catherine is Martha's sister. I think Catherine was a woman that we saw because Tom was paying for an apartment for Martha in the city. And it seems like her sister, Catherine, was always there. So that's who Catherine is, Myrtle's sister. Yeah, Sirkan Sonal says Myrtle's sister. Yeah, that's right. You're right. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth, rocking back and forth. This is rocking back and forth. While George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. McKellis and several other men were with him. First 4 or 5 men, later 2 or 3 men. Still later, McKellis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering. Incoherent means it doesn't make any sense, and muttering is angry talking. I don't know, it could be anything you're saying. Maybe you don't even understand it. It's just that tone. So, and that's incoherent, what I'm doing. You can't understand what I'm saying. You just understand that I'm angry. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to, and then he blurted out that a couple of months ago his wife had come home from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. Oh my. So to blurt something out is when you're holding a secret in your mind and suddenly it becomes so powerful, it really wants to come out, and suddenly you just say it very quickly. That's blurting something out. It's you're trying to hold something. It could be a secret, but it could also be like a comment. You know, have you ever been in the company of someone who you hate? But it's not nice to say that you hate them. It's not nice to say bad things to them. So you keep it inside. But you're just thinking in your mind, oh, I hate you. And suddenly you can't control it anymore. It comes out, I hate you. That's blurting out, I hate you. It's when something is in your head and you can no longer keep it in your head. You have to say it. That's a pretty useful, I like that phrasal verb. That's a good one that probably a lot of people don't know. Oh, so Martha, it seems like Tom abuses Martha because she came home once from the apartment with a bruised face and a swollen nose. Let's look at that for a minute in case you don't know what the word bruise means. Let's look at a bruised face. This is a bruised face. That's a very weird picture. That's like the first picture they show is this woman with a bruised face like she's enjoying it. I hate Google. I used to think Google was great, but now I think they're stupid. Why did they do that? That is like the most illogical picture you could find. So we get the picture. This is a bruised face. Swollen, and swollen, if something is hit really hard, it becomes big for a while. And that's swollen. Swell, swole, swollen. Let's see if we can find a picture of a swollen nose. Swollen nose. I think that would be a harder picture to find. But it's a Google picture. It'll probably be somebody with a swollen nose going like this. Let's see. No, well, it just means bigger. Probably bigger because it was hit recently. But there aren't really any, and these are discussed. Oh, here's kind of a swollen nose. That's definitely a swollen nose, this red one here. But that's because of inflammation, of like an infection or something. Okay, let's go back to the story. So let's look at that again, starting from blurted out. Let's see. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to. And then he blurted out. So he's trying to keep this in his head, but he can't keep it in his head any longer. That a couple of months ago, his wife had come home from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched. Flinching is when you think someone's going to hit you or something is coming close to you, you move. You move very quickly out of the way. That's flinching. And then he flinched. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh my God!" Again his groaning voice. Michaelis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there. Try and sit still for a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married?" 12 years. "Ever had any children?" "Come on, George. Sit still. I asked you a question. Did you have any children?" The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like a car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. Anne is asking about the word thud. I don't even remember hearing that. I don't even remember seeing that word. A thud is like a deep, loud sound. That's kind of a thud. It's usually, that's a thud. That's a sound. Something falling and making that sound is a thud. I don't remember seeing that word. The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light. So, do you know what a beetle is? So there must be a lot of these very large bugs. These are beetles. So imagine a beetle falling. They're pretty big. They're pretty heavy. So if a beetle falls or hits up against something, you'll hear a sound kind of like, but obviously not that loud. And that would be a thud. The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like a car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. It sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. So every time Michaelis hears a car, he thinks, "Oh, that's the car I heard a few hours before." He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. "Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe if you haven't been there for a long time, maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over and he could talk to you, see? Don't belong to any." "You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church?" That was a long time ago. The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking. For a moment he was silent, and then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered look came back into his faded eyes. "Look in the drawer there," he said, pointing at the desk. "Which drawer?" "That drawer, that one." Michaelis opened the drawer nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small, expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. "This?" he inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. "I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny." Now remember, that word funny could mean ha ha ha, but also funny means strange. So I knew it was something strange. Not funny, not ha ha ha, but something odd, something not normal. "You mean your wife bought it? She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau." Michaelis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash. But conceivably, Wilson had heard some of these same explanations before. From Myrtle, because he began saying, "Oh my God," again in a whisper. His comforter left several explanations in the air. "Then he killed her?" said Wilson. "Then he killed her," said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. "Who did?" "I have a way of finding out." "You're morbid, George," said his friend. "This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet till morning." "He murdered her." "It was an accident, George." Wilson shook his head. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth widened slightly with the ghost of a superior "I know," he said definitely. "I'm one of these trusting fellows, and I don't think any harm to nobody. But when I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car. She ran out to speak to him, and he wouldn't stop." Michaelis had seen this too, but it hadn't occurred to him that there was any significance in it. He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband rather than trying to stop any particular car. How could she have been like that? "She's a deep one," said Wilson, as if that answered the question. I'm not even sure what he's asking. He began to rock again, and Michaelis stood twisting the leash in his hand. "Maybe you got some friend that you could telephone for, George?" This was a forlorn hope. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend, and there was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room, a blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off, about 5 o'clock. It was blue enough outside to snap off the light. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heaps, where small gray clouds took on fantastic shape and scurried across here and there in the faint dawn wind. Scurrying is moving very fast, very quickly in many directions. I spoke to her, he muttered, after a long silence. I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window. With an effort, he got up and walked to the rear and leaned with his face pressed against it, and I said, God knows what you've been doing. Everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God. Standing behind him, Michaelis saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged, pale and enormous, from the dissolving night. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. That's an advertisement, Michaelis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room, but Wilson stood there a long time, his face close to the window pane, nodding into the twilight. By 6 o'clock, Michaelis was worn out and grateful for the sound of a car stopping outside. It was one of the watchers of the night before who had promised to come back so he could cook breakfast. So he cooked breakfast for 3, which he and the other man ate together. Wilson was quieter now, and Michaelis went home to sleep. When he awoke 4 hours later and hurried back to the garage, Wilson was gone. His movements, he was on foot all the time, were afterward traced to Port Roosevelt, and then to Gad's Hill, where he bought a sandwich that he didn't eat and a cup of coffee. He must have been tired and walking slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. Thus far, there was no difficulty in accounting for time. There were boys who had seen the man acting sort of crazy, and motorists at whom he stared oddly from the side of the road. And then for 3 hours he disappeared from view. The police, on the strength of what he said to Michaelis, that he had a way of finding out, supposed that he spent that time going from garage to garage thereabouts, inquiring for a yellow car. On the other hand, no garage man who had seen him ever came forward, and perhaps he had an easier, surer way of finding out what he wanted to know. By 2:30 he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gatsby's house. So by that time he knew Gatsby's name. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, it was to be brought to him at the pool. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress and had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Then he gave instructions that the open car wasn't to be taken out under any circumstances, and this was strange because the front right fender needed repair. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head in a moment and disappeared among the yellowing trees. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was any hope to give it to... There was anyone... I think I'm getting tired. Let me reread that. All right. Until long, there was anyone to give it to if it came. That's just a weird sentence. It's not me, it's the sentence. Well, let's try that again. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock. Until long after, there was anyone to give it to if it came. Okay, so the butler waited until there was a phone message, but it was so late by that time. When he received the message, there was no one to give it to. Okay, I get it. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. The chauffeur. He was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterwards, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. With scarcely a word, said four of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With little ripples. Ripples are little, when you see water and the little, I better show you a picture. I don't know how to describe it in words. We've had that word before, though. I'm sure we talked about it. These are ripples. These are ripples in the water. So the lines of movement in a water. See, these are ripples in sand. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of... Let's try that again. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly. They're talking about the dead body. Revolved it slowly, tracing like the leg of a compass, a thin red circle in the water. It was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. Okay, so that was chapter 8. And now we're going to read chapter 9, and then this will be the end of the book. Isn't that exciting? All right, so here's chapter 9. Sirkan is telling me to rest. No, I want to move on to another book, so I'm happy to finish it today. Not that I want it to end, but it's kind of fun to actually finish the book, don't you think? It's exciting when you get to the end of a book, because you say, wow, I read that whole thing. So we have to push forward. After 2 years, I remember the rest of that day and that night and the next day, and only as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspaper men in and out of Gatsby's front door, a rope stretched across the main gate, and a policeman by it kept out the curious. But little boys soon discovered that they could enter through my yard, and there were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. Someone, with a positive manner, perhaps a detective, used the expression madman as he bent over Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventitious authority of his voice set the key for the newspaper reports the next morning. Adventitious. What does that mean? Adventitious. Adventitious, happening or carried out according to chance rather than design. But these are not words. These are not common words that you have to worry about using in everyday conversation. So don't use that word. Nobody will know what you're talking about if you say adventitious. They'll think advantageous? Where was that word? I want to see it in the sentence. Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventitious authority of his voice. That doesn't make any sense. Carried out according to chance rather than design or inherent nature. Coming from outside, not native. Formed accidentally or unusual. I'm not even sure how it's used here. Adventitious authority. Maybe that means that he usually doesn't feel like he has that kind of authority. It's just coming to him from the moment, I guess. Okay, most of those reports were a nightmare, grotesque, circumstantial, eager, and untrue. When McKellar's testimony at the inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife, I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in racy pasquinade. What is that? Pasquinade.
Pasquinade.
Satire or lampoon. Pasquinade. How did they use that? I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in a racy pasquinade. So pasquinade is a satire or a lampoon. And a satire or a lampoon is like a story that tries to... It's a way of telling a story where you're making fun of how ridiculous everything is. An inquest... N is saying an inquest? Well, an inquest would be like a serious investigation of something, asking questions and trying to find the answer. A pasquinade, which is not a word that you have to worry about. Don't think about memorizing this word because nobody will understand it. But it's a type of way of telling a story, like a comic way of telling a story where you focus on how ridiculous everything is. But Catherine, who might have said anything, didn't say a word. She showed a surprising amount of character about it, too. Looked at the coroner. A coroner is an official, a government official, whose job it is to say, yep, that person's dead. That person is officially dead. So the coroner has to always be present when someone is dead, because he's like the expert on knowing that people are dead. Looked at the coroner with determined eyes under that corrected brow of hers, and she swore that her sister had never seen Gatsby, that her sister was completely happy with her husband, and that her sister had been into no mischief whatever. She convinced herself of it and cried into her handkerchief as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. So Wilson was reduced to a man deranged by grief, in order that the case might remain in the simplest form, and it rested there. Miriam says, I didn't like the end. Well, we're not at the end yet. I don't know what happens at the end. So something bad happens? Something worse? But all this part of it seemed remote and unessential. I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. From the moment I telephoned news of the catastrophe to West Egg Village, every surmise about him and every practical question was referred to me. At first I was surprised and confused, and then as he lay in his house and didn't move or breathe or speak hour upon hour, it grew upon me that I was responsible because no one else was interested. Interested, I mean, with the intense impersonal interest to which everyone has some vague right at the end. I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him, called her instinctively and without hesitation. But she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address? No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are now? How could I reach them? I don't know. Can't say. I wanted to get somebody for him. I wanted to get into the room where he lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry. Just trust me and I'll get somebody for you. Meyer Wolfsheim's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway, and I called information, but by the time I had the number, it was long after 5 and no one answered the phone. N is asking about the word surmise. To surmise is like to guess something, but let me check. Let me check the official definition. Suppose that something is true without having evidence to confirm it. It's kind of a fancy way of saying guess. Sircon says, Daisy, oh Daisy, so materialistic. Daisy. Well, they all are, aren't they? It's not just Daisy. It's every single one of them. Even Martha, the woman who died in the street. Miriam says, I hate Daisy. Well, I don't know. She's not the only guilty one. They're all guilty. I went back to the drawing room and thought for an instant that they were chance visitors. And all these official people who suddenly filled it. But as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoved eyes, his protest continued in my brain. Look here, old sport. You've got to get somebody for me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. Someone started to ask me questions, but I broke away, and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead, but there was nothing, only the picture of Dan Cody, a token of forgotten violence staring down from the wall. Next morning I sent the butler to New York with a letter for Wolfsheim, which asked for information and urged him to come out on the next train. That request seemed superfluous when I wrote it. Superfluous means unnecessary, extra, and unnecessary, unneeded. I was sure he'd start when he saw the newspapers, just as I was sure there'd be a wire from Daisy before noon, but neither a wire nor Mr. Wolfsheim arrived. No one arrived except more police and photographers and newspaper men. When the butler brought back Wolfsheim's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me and them all. Dear Mr. Carraway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks from my life. I can hardly believe that it is true at all. Such a mad act as that a man did should make us all think. I cannot come down now as I'm tied up in some very important business and cannot get mixed up in this thing now. If there's anything I can do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and I am completely knocked down and out. Yours, Meyer Wolfsheim, and then a hasty addenda beneath. Let me know about the funeral, etc. Do not know his family at all. When the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought this would be Daisy at last. But the connection came through as a man's voice, very thin and far away. This is Slagle speaking. Yes, the name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Got my wire. Got my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. They got a circular from New York giving him numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, eh? You can never tell in these hick towns. So I guess maybe this is one of Gatsby's business associates, and he's talking about business. I don't really understand what he's talking about. Hello? I interrupted breathlessly. Look here, this isn't Mr. Gatsby? Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, then a quick squawk as the connection was broken. I think it was on the third day that a telegram signed Henry C. Gatz arrived from a town in Minnesota. It was said only that the sender was leaving immediately to postpone the funeral until he came. It was Gatsby's father, a solemn old man, very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long, cheap ulster against the warm September day. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement, and when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse gray beard that I had difficulty in getting off his coat. He was so on the point of collapse, so I took him into the music room and made him sit down a while. I sent for something to eat, but he wouldn't eat, and the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. I saw it in the Chicago paper, he said. It was all in the Chicago newspaper. I started right away. I didn't know how to reach you. His eyes, seeing nothing, moved ceaselessly about the room. It was a madman, he said. He must have been mad. Wouldn't you like some coffee? I urged him. I don't want anything. I'm all right now. Mr. Carraway. Well, I'm all right now. Where have they got Jimmy? I took him into the drawing room where his son lay and left him there. Some little boys had come up to the steps and were looking into the hall. When I told them who had arrived, they went reluctantly away. After a little while, Mr. Gatz opened the door and came out, his mouth ajar. Remember, jar means something is a little bit open. So his mouth ajar means like this. His mouth is a little bit open. His face flushed slightly, his eyes leaking isolated and unpunctual tears. He had reached an age where death no longer has the quality of ghastly surprise. And when he looked around him now for the first time and saw the height and splendor of the hall and the great rooms opening out from into other rooms, his grief began to be mixed with an awed pride. I helped him to a bedroom upstairs while he took off his coat and vest, and I told him that all the arrangements had been deferred until he came. I didn't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby. Gatz is my name. Mr. Gatz. I thought you might want to take the body west. He shook his head. Jimmy always liked it better down east. He rose up to his position in the east. Were you a friend of my boy's, Mr.? We were close friends. He had a big future before him, you know. He was only a young man, but he had a lot of brain power here. He touched his head impressively, and I nodded. If he'd have lived, he'd have been a great man. A man like James J. Hill. He'd have helped build up the country. That's true, I said uncomfortably. He fumbled at the embroidered coverlet, tried to take it from the bed, and lay down stiffly, was instantly asleep. That night, an obviously frightened person called up and demanded to know who I was before he would give his name. This is Mr. Carraway, I said. Oh, he sounded relieved. This is Klipspringer. I was relieved too, for that seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I didn't want it to be in the papers and draw a sightseeing crowd, so I'd been calling up a few people myself. They were hard to find. "The funeral's tomorrow," I said, 3 o'clock, here at the house. "I wish you'd tell anybody who'd be interested." "Oh, I will," he broke out hastily. "Of course, I'm not likely to see anybody, but if I do..." His tone made me suspicious. "Of course, you'll be there yourself." "Well, I'll certainly try." "What I called about is..." "Wait a minute," I interrupted. "How about saying you'll come?" "Well, the fact is, the truth of the matter is that I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something. See, that's the problem. All these people are just trying to have a good time, so everybody's guilty. Martha was trying to have a good time. Daisy was trying to have a good time. Gatsby was trying to have a good time. They were all just looking out for their own self-interests. So how could we be surprised when nobody really wants to go to his funeral in the end? They've got better things to do, like feel good. Kind of like now." "In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something." "I'll do my very best to get away," I ejaculated, and unstrained, "Huh?" And he must have heard it, for he went on nervously, "What I called about was a pair of shoes I left there. I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to have the butler send them on. You see, they're tennis shoes, and I'm sort of helpless without them. My address is BF..." I didn't hear the rest of the name because I hung up the phone. I hung up the receiver. After that, I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he had got what he deserved. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer. Sneering is... Yeah, I can't sneer. It's kind of a look of hatred, of disgust and hatred. There, that's a good sneer. He used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. Miriam says Daisy was quite moody and unsure of what she really wanted in life, and Gatsby ended up sacrificing himself to someone so unstable. But it seems like, Gatsby didn't have anything else. That was his only reason for doing all of this, was for her, right? So he had nothing else to live for, nothing else to do. It was just about her. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that he made that sacrifice. He did everything else for her too, didn't he? Not that I don't think that I like any of the characters in this book. So I'm not on anybody's side in any of this. I think they're all horrible. Is that just me? The morning of the funeral, I went up to New York to see Meyer Wolsheim. I couldn't seem to reach him any other way. The door that I pushed open on the advice of an elevator boy was marked the Swastika Holding Company. And at first, there hadn't seemed to be anyone inside, but when I shouted hello several times in vain, an argument broke out behind a partition, and presently a lovely Jewess appeared in an interior door and scrutinized me with black, hostile eyes. "Nobody's in," she said. "Mr. Wolsheim's gone to Chicago." Sirkan says, except the butler. Yeah, except the butler and the father. I mean, there are a couple of innocent people, but they're like side characters. All of the main characters are horrible. The first part of this was obviously untrue, for someone had begun to whistle the rosary tunelessly inside. "Please say that Mr. Carroway wants to see him. I can't get him back from Chicago, can I?" At this moment a voice, unmistakably Wolsheim's, called Stella. "Stella!" from the other side of the door. "Leave your name on the desk," she said quickly. "I'll give it to him when he gets back." But I know he's here. She took a step toward me and began to slide her hands indignantly up and down her hips. You young men think you can force your way in here any time, she scolded. We're getting sick and tired of it. And I say he's in Chicago, he's in Chicago. I mentioned Gatsby. Miriam says, in my opinion, the worst part is that he paid for his love with his life. Yeah, but, was it really love? Because there were some indications that when he finally did get to spend time with her after all of this time, he was disappointed. That was that day that they had lunch at Nick's house in the rain, and then he took her to his enormous house and showed her around. Nick was commenting, I could see that he had built up this thing that she could never possibly meet his expectations. So Nick could see the disappointment that afternoon, that it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. What he thought it was going to be was perfect, and it wasn't perfect. So I don't think that he sacrificed himself because he loved her. I think he was in love with loving her. That's what I think. Which is superficial. I mentioned Gatsby. Oh, she looked me over again. Will you just... What's your name? She vanished. In a moment, Meyer Wolsheim stood solemnly at the doorway, holding out both hands. He drew me into his office, remarking in a reverent voice that it was a sad time for all of us, and offered me a cigar. My memory goes back to when I first met him, he said, a young major just out of the army, and covered all over with medals he got in the war. He was so hard up. To be hard up means desperate for money. He was so hard up, he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. First time I saw him was when he come into Winnebrenner's pool room on 43rd Street and asked for a job. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days. Come on, have some lunch with me, I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. Did you start him in business? I inquired. Start him. I made him. Oh. I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away he was a fine-appearing, gentlemanly young man, and when he told me he was in Oxford, I knew I could use him good. I got him to join up in the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off, he did some work for a client of mine up at Albany. We were so thick like that and everything. He held up 2 bulbous fingers, always together. Miriam says yes, maybe because he spent those 5 years creating an idealized version of Daisy in his mind. Yeah, they're all chasing after something that doesn't exist. I wondered if his partnership had included the World Series transaction in 1919. Now he's dead, I said, after a moment. You were his closest friend. So I know you'll want to come to his funeral this afternoon. I'd like to come. Well, come then. The hair in his nostrils quivered slightly as he shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. I can't do it. I can't get mixed up in it, he said. There's nothing to get mixed up in. It's all over now. When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in any way. I keep out. When I was a young man, it was different. If a friend of mine died, no matter how, I stuck with them to the end. You may think that's sentimental, but I meant it to the bitter end. I saw that for some reason of his own, he was determined not to come, so I stood up. Sirkan says, the American Dream. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. The American dream is maybe just to have a house and some kids and a car, I guess. But these people, I don't know. They're very hedonistic. The word is hedonistic. They just want to enjoy themselves. They want to drink alcohol, have parties, play games, and they don't want any bad news or any sadness to interrupt their lives. And yet they look for it because they're so bored with their lives that they have to create drama. And this, I guess, is what happens. I saw that for some reason of his own, he was determined not, so I stood up. "Are you a college man?" he inquired suddenly. For a moment, I thought he was going to suggest a connection, but he only nodded and shook my hand. "Let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he is alive, and not after he's dead," he suggested. "After that, my own rule is to let everything alone." When I left his office, the sky had turned dark, and I had got back to West Egg in a drizzle. A drizzle is a very light rain. Anne says maybe not Gatsby's love was quite authentic as well, but caused by reaching high status for money. It's a quite superficial world with fake friendship, love, and family values. Yes, well, I guess. I guess when you have, I don't know what it's like to have a lot of money, but that seems to be how it is. After changing my clothes, I went next door and found Mr. Gatz walking up and down excitedly in the hall. His pride in his son and in his son's possessions was continually increasing, and now he had something to show me. "Jimmy sent me this picture." He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. "Look here," or "look there." It was a photograph of the house, cracked in the corners, dirty with many hands. He pointed out every detail to me eagerly. "Look there," and then he sought admiration from my eyes. He had shown it so often that I think it was more real to him now than the house itself. "Jimmy sent it to me. I think it's a very pretty picture. It shows up very well." "Very well. Had you seen him lately?" "He come out to see me 2 years ago. He bought me the house I live in now. Of course, we was broke up when we run off from home, but I see now there was a reason for it. He knew he had a big future in front of him, and ever since he made a success of he was very generous with me." He seemed reluctant to put the picture away. Held it for another minute, and lingeringly before my eyes. Remember, linger means that something stays when it should be going. So he was about to take the picture away, but he held it lingeringly. He just had to wait a few more minutes before he took it away. Then he returned the wallet and pulled from his pocket a ragged old copy of a book called Hopalong Cassidy. "Look here, this is a book he had when he was a boy. It just shows you." He opened it back to the cover and turned it around for me to see. On the last fly leaf, there was printed the words "schedule" and the date, September 12th, 1906, and under, "Rise from bed, 6 a.m., dumbbell exercise and wall scaling." Dumbbells, let me show you what a dumbbell is. You might be surprised when you see what that is. This is a dumbbell. It's also a stupid person. So if somebody does something stupid, you can say, "You dumbbell," but that's not nice. So just be careful. Because you're saying, "You idiot, you stupid person, you dumbbell." And scaling is climbing. So that's his schedule. Wake up from bed, 6 a.m. 6:15 to 6:30, dumbbell exercises. And wall scaling. Scaling is climbing. Climbing the wall. Study electricity, etc. 7:15, 8:15. Work. 8:30, 4:30. Baseball and sports. 4:35. Practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it. 5 to 6. Study needed inventions. 7 to 9. General resolves. No wasting time at shafters, or a name indecipherable. So no wasting time at maybe some place where all the young kids go to have fun and hang out. And it says a name indecipherable. That means you can't really read it. You can't really see what it says. No more smoking or chewing. Bath every other day. Read one improving book or magazine per week. Save $5, crossed out, 3 per week. Be better to parents. I come across this book by accident, said the old man. It just shows you, don't it? It just shows you. Jimmy was bound to get ahead. He always had some resolve like this or something. Do you notice what he's got about improving his mind? He was always great for that. He told me, I ate like a hog once and I beat him for it. I ate like a hog, I guess. He was reluctant to close the book, reading each item aloud, and then looking eagerly at me. I think he's rather expected me to copy down the list for my own use. A little before 3, the Lutheran minister arrived from Flushing, and I began to look involuntarily out the windows for other cars. So did Gatsby's father. As the time passed and the servants came in and stood waiting in the hall, his eyes began to blink anxiously. He spoke of the rain in worried, uncertain way. The minister glanced several times at his watch, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for half an hour. But it wasn't any use. Nobody came. Anne is asking about bound to. Where was bound to? I don't remember reading that word. Bound to. Oh, Jimmy was bound to get ahead. To bind something is to connect something, or to be connected to something. So to be bound to do something means you're probably going to do it. You're most likely going to do it. There's a 99% chance you're going to do it. It's a pretty high probability. You're going on a long trip, you better take a snack, or you're bound to get hungry. That will be your destination. Your destination will be hunger. Stop talking to me like that. Stop insulting me, or I'm bound to get angry. My destination, if you continue down this road, my destination is anger. So that's how you use bound. And so his father says about him, Jimmy was bound to get ahead. Jimmy was bound to be successful. Obviously, he was going to be successful. He works so hard every day at improvement. About 5 o'clock, our procession of 3 cars reached the cemetery and stopped in a thick drizzle beside the gate. First a motor hearse. A hearse is the car that will carry a dead body. Horribly black and wet. And then Mr. Gatz and the minister, and I in the limousine. And a little later, 4 or 5 servants and the postman from West Egg in Gatsby's station wagon. All wet to the skin. As we started through the gate into the cemetery, I heard a car stop, and then the sound of someone splashing after us over the soggy ground. Soggy means very wet. I looked around. It was the man with the owl-eyed glasses whom I'd found marveling over Gatsby's book in the library one night 3 months before. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how he knew about the funeral, or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. I tried to think about Gatsby then for a moment, but He was already too far away, and I could only remember without resentment that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. Dimly I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on." And then the owl-eyed man said amen to that in a brave voice. We straggled down quickly through the rain to the cars. Owl Eyes spoke to me by the gate. I couldn't get to the house, he remarked. Neither could anyone else. Go on, he started. Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds. He took off his glasses and wiped again outside and in. The poor son of a bitch, he said. One of my most vivid memories of coming back west was from prep school and later from college at Christmas time. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening with a few Chicago friends already caught up into their own holiday gaieties and bid them a hasty goodbye. I remember the fur coats of girls returning from this or that, and the chatter of frozen breath and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances and the matchings of invitations. Are you going to the Ordways or the Herseys or the Schultzes? And the green tickets clasped tight in the gloved hands, and last the murky yellow cars of Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate. When we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us, and the twinkle against the windows and the dim lights of the small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp, wild brace came suddenly into the air. We drew in deep breaths of it as we walked back from dinner through the cold vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour before we melted indistinguishably into it. That's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning of trains of my youth, and the street lamps and sleigh bells and the frosty dark and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. I am a part of that, a little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where the dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. I see now that this has been a story of the West, after all, Tom, and Gatsby and Daisy and Jordan and I. We're all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some of the deficiency in common made us by the made subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. Even when the West excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio, with their interminable inquisitions which spared only the children and the very old, even then it had always for me a quality of distortion. West Egg especially still figures in my more fantastic dreams. I see it as a night scene by El Greco. 100 houses at once, conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen overhanging sky, and the lusterless moon in the foreground. 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the side, with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand which dangles, her hand which dangles from the side sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely the men turn in at the house, the wrong house, but no one knows the woman's name and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes, power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. There was one thing to be done before I left, an awkward, unpleasant thing that perhaps had better have been left alone, but I wanted to leave things in order, and not just trust that obliging and indifferent sea to sweep my refuse away. I saw Jordan Baker and talked over and around what happened to us together and what happened afterward to me, and she lay perfectly still, listening in a big chair. She was dressed to play golf, and I remember thinking she looked like a good illustration, her chin raised a little jauntily, her hair the color of autumn leaf, her face the same brown tint and fingerless glove on her knee. And when I had finished, she told me without comment that she was engaged to another man. I doubted that though there were several, she could have married at a nod of her head, but I pretended to be surprised. For just a minute, I wondered if I wasn't making a mistake. Then I thought it all over again quickly and got up to say goodbye. "Nevertheless, you did throw me over," said Jordan suddenly. "You threw me over on the telephone. I don't give a damn about you now. But it was a new experience for me, and I felt a little dizzy for a while." We shook hands. So she's complaining that he was mean to her on the phone? It's so silly. We shook hands. "Oh, and do you remember," she added, "a conversation we once had about driving a car?" "Why, not exactly." "You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver." "Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride." "I'm 30, I said. "I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor." She didn't answer. Angry and half in love with her, and tremendously sorry, I turned away. One afternoon late in October, I saw Tom Buchanan. He was walking ahead of me along Fifth Avenue in his alert, aggressive way, his hands out a little from his body, as if to fight off an interference, his head moving sharply here and there, adapting itself to his restless eyes. Just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him, he stopped and began frowning into the window of a jewelry store. Suddenly, he saw me and walked back, holding out his hand. "What's the matter, Nick?" "Do you object to shaking hands with me?" "Yes, you know what I think of you." "You're crazy, Nick," he said. "Crazy as hell. I don't know what's the matter with you." "Tom," I inquired, "what did you say to Wilson that afternoon?" And he stared at me without a word, and I knew he had guessed right about those missing hours. I started to turn away, but he took a step after me and grabbed my arm. "I told him the truth," he said. "He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't in the tried..." Wait a minute. Let me see that again. "I sent down word that we weren't in. He tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car." His hand was on a revolver in his pocket every minute he was in the house. He broke off defiantly. "What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust into your eyes just like he did into Daisy's. But he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog, and never even stopped his car." Well, Myrtle didn't have a problem running over her husband as if he were a dog. And if you think I didn't have my share of suffering, look here. When I went to give up that flat and saw that damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful. I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. I've lost my place. Let me find it. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then treated them back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. And then he went into the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons, rid myself of provincial squeamishness forever. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn had grown long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about it all his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter faint in the incessant from his garden, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there and saw its lights stop at its front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably it was some final guest who had been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know that the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at the huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick stood out clearly on the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. And then I wandered down the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Sprawling out is like this, making yourself big. So it sounds like he laid down in the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed up now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island, here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh, green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate with the capacity for wonder. As I sat there brooding means like sitting and feeling sorry for yourself, feeling bad, feeling depressed. As I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's stock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn. Oh, I can't scroll up. This is the end of the book. I can't show you the final paragraph. It won't let me scroll up. So as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's stock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity. I can't even read this. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eludes us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow will be run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. All right, well, that was the end of The Great Gatsby. So someone had suggested that I read Gone with the Wind next, which I never really thought about doing, but that seems like an interesting idea, and I think that's probably what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to start doing Gone with the Wind. That should be pretty interesting, I think, but it's a pretty long book. So I think we'll start doing that very soon. Well, thank you everybody who stayed and watched, and thank you for your comments and your questions, and I hope you come back when I start reading the next book, which I believe will be Gone with the Wind. Miriam says, hooray. So was that you, Miriam, who said do Gone with the Wind? All right, so I think I will start that, because I'm doing this one in the morning, I will start that next. Oh, let me check my schedule. Probably Thursday. Yeah. So this time next Thursday, we can start with Gone with the Wind. All right. Well, so thank you everybody who stayed and watched and asked questions, and I hope you come back next Thursday at this time as we begin Gone with the Wind. But until then, goodbye.